The check was for $2. Corinne Aldergate held it up to the light in the lawyer's office, certain the ink had smudged, certain she was reading it wrong. It hadn't smudged. It said $2 in Julius's own careful handwriting, torn from the back of an old checkbook he'd stopped using years before he died. Her son sat 3 feet away, already scrolling through real estate listings on his phone. Her daughter wouldn't look at her at all. 39 years of marriage, and this was what her husband had left her with, while the house on Larchmont Avenue, the boat, the savings account with 6 figures in it, went to 2 children who'd barely called their father twice a month. Corinne folded the check in half, then in half again, until it was small enough to disappear into her fist. What none of them knew, not her children, not the lawyer reading in his flat courtroom voice, was that a folder sitting untouched in a filing cabinet 2 floors below them held a second will. One that Julius had signed 4 months before he died. One that would take the county 11 days, a locksmith, and a woman named Odessa Kwan to help her find. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Corinne had met Julius Aldergate in 1987 at a diner outside Hollow Pine, Maine, where she was waitressing double shifts to pay for night classes she never finished. He was 12 years older, a boat mechanic with grease permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles, and he'd left her a $5 tip on a $2 coffee the first time he came in. She married him 18 months later in her mother's backyard, wearing a dress she'd altered herself because there wasn't money for a new one. They built a life the slow way. Julius worked the docks, then opened his own repair shop, then expanded it twice. Corinne raised their 2 children, kept the books for the shop on weekends, and never once asked for more than what they had. Dominic came first in 1985. Vivian followed 2 years later. Corinne loved them without condition, the way you're supposed to, but she noticed things over the years that she chose for a long time not to name out loud. Dominic borrowed money and paid it back late, if at all. Vivian called on holidays and birthdays and almost nothing in between. When Julius's shop finally sold, netting them more than either child had ever seen their parents earn, the calls got more frequent. Vivian started asking about the estate. Dominic brought his wife to Sunday dinners and steered every conversation toward what their father planned to do with the money once he was gone. Julius got sick in the spring of 2022. Pancreatic cancer, caught late, the kind of diagnosis that give you a calendar instead of a future. He spent his last 8 months in the house on Larchmont Avenue, and Corinne spent them beside him, feeding him, bathing him, listening to him talk about the shop and the boat and the years they'd had. Dominic visited 4 times. Vivian visited twice, both times with a folder of paperwork she wanted her father to sign, updates to beneficiary forms, a power of attorney document she said was just a precaution. Julius, weak and exhausted and wanting peace more than anything, signed some of what she put in front of him. Corinne wasn't in the room for all of it. She wishes now that she had been. He died in November, on a Tuesday, with Corinne holding his hand and the tide coming in outside the window he'd asked to be moved next to. She grieved the way anyone grieves a person they built 40 years with. She did not think, in those weeks, about wills or estates or what came next. She assumed, the way you assume gravity will keep working, that Julius had taken care of her. He always had. The reading was scheduled for early December at the office of a lawyer named Malcolm Threnody, a firm called Threnody and Voss that Dominic had recommended, a firm Corinne had never heard her husband mention once in 39 years. She should have thought that was strange. She didn't, not until she was sitting in a leather chair across from a man she'd never met, listening to him read a will that gave everything, the house, the boat, the shop's remaining assets, $412,000 in savings, to Dominic and Vivian Aldergate Cross in equal shares, and to Corinne Aldergate, his wife of 39 years, the sum of $2, for reasons she will understand. She didn't understand. That was the cruelest part. She sat in that chair, trying to think of a single reason, and came up with nothing except the quiet, sick feeling that something about the paper in front of her was wrong in a way she couldn't yet prove. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dominic didn't look at her when Threnody finished reading. He was already talking, low and fast, to his sister about contractors and closing dates, as though their father's ashes weren't still sitting in an urn on the mantel at home. Vivian did look at her, once, a flicker of something that might have been guilt if Corinne hadn't known her whole life not to mistake her daughter's discomfort for conscience. Neither of them asked if she was all right. Neither of them asked where she planned to live. Corinne stood, took the check because refusing it felt like giving them the satisfaction of a scene, and walked out of that office into a cold the color of wet concrete. She had $1,100 in a checking account that was hers alone, a car with a bad transmission, and a $2 check she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Not yet. Not because she thought it was worth anything, but because some stubborn, wounded part of her wanted proof, later, of exactly how little her own children had thought she deserved. She didn't know yet that Malcolm Threnody had noticed something during the reading that he hadn't said out loud. A date on a document that didn't match. A signature that looked, to a man who'd spent 22 years reading wills for a living, just slightly off. 3 days after the reading, Corinne's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She'd been screening calls since the funeral, mostly out of exhaustion, partly because 2 different real estate agents had already tried to reach her about the Larchmont property, as if she had any say in what happened to it now. But something made her pick up on the 4th ring. Mrs. Aldergate, this is Malcolm Threnody. We met at the reading of your husband's will. She almost hung up on him right there. He was, as far as she understood it, the man who'd read out her humiliation in a calm, professional voice and then shaken her hand at the door like nothing unusual had happened. I don't have anything to say to you, Mr. Threnody. I understand that. I wouldn't blame you. A pause, longer than she expected from a lawyer, who she'd assumed talked for a living the way other people breathed. I'm calling because I think there's something you should know, and I'd rather tell you in person than over the phone. Corinne stood in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd made Julius's coffee every morning for 2 decades, and felt her whole body go still in the particular way it does when you sense, before you can explain why, that the ground under you has shifted. Know about what? I'd rather not say more until we're face to face. Tomorrow, if you're free. My office, or somewhere else, if you prefer neutral ground. She chose a diner on the edge of town, not the one where she'd met Julius, but close enough in spirit that she felt steadier walking into it. Malcolm Threnody was already there when she arrived, a cup of black coffee going cold in front of him, a slim leather folder on the table that he hadn't opened. He was younger than she'd registered at the reading, maybe 50, with the kind of tired, careful face that belonged to someone who'd spent a career being the person who delivered bad news for a living. I want to start by saying this could be nothing, he told her once she'd sat down. I want to be honest about that, because I don't want to give you false hope and then take it away. You didn't drive out here to tell me it's nothing, Corinne said. He almost smiled at that. No, I didn't. He opened the folder and slid a single sheet across the table. Not the will itself, but a photocopy of the signature page. Your husband's shop files were transferred to storage after the sale. Standard procedure. I was going through them last week to close out some paperwork, and I found something that didn't belong there. A folder with your husband's name on it, filed under a client code from 4 months before he died. Not connected to the will your children brought me. Corinne stared at the photocopy. Julius's signature, the same looping J, the same abrupt little downstroke on the S, appeared twice on the page, once at the top of the document Threnody had read aloud in his office, once at the bottom of whatever this new page was. They didn't match. Not wildly. Not in a way anyone glancing at them would notice, but enough that once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The first was smaller, tighter, slightly rushed. The second was looser, more like the handwriting she'd watched her husband use for 40 years on grocery lists and birthday cards and the backs of napkins in diners, just like this one. I'm not accusing anyone of anything yet, Threnody said carefully. I want to be clear about that. Forgery cases are difficult, and family estate disputes are the kind of thing that can drag on for years and destroy everyone involved, even when the truth eventually comes out. but I have 22 years of experience reading signatures on legal documents, Mrs. Aldergate, and something about the will your children presented to me does not sit right. What was in the folder? Corinne's voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. I don't know yet. It was locked in a drawer that requires a key. I don't have access to an old filing cabinet that came over with the shop's records and was never fully cataloged. I found the label. I haven't been able to open it. He closed the folder again, as though even holding it open too long felt like a risk. I wanted to tell you before I did anything else, because if I'm wrong about this, I didn't want you finding out from a rumor, and if I'm right, I didn't want to go digging through your late husband's private files without your knowledge and your permission. Corinne sat with that for a long moment, watching steam rise off a coffee she hadn't touched. 11 days earlier, she'd been sitting beside her husband's hospital bed, promising him things would be all right. 3 days earlier, she'd been handed a $2 check by a man who wouldn't look her in the eye. And now a stranger with a tired face was telling her that somewhere in a locked drawer, there might be a version of Julius's last wishes that nobody had ever let her see. Open it, she said. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. I want to know what's in that drawer. Threnody nodded slowly, like he'd been hoping she'd say exactly that. I'll need a locksmith. I know one who's discreet and fast and doesn't ask questions he doesn't need answered. Ooh, her name's Odessa Kwan. She's good at what she does, and she's the kind of person who minds her own business until you ask her not to. Odessa Kwan showed up at the storage facility on Route 9 the following afternoon, driving a truck with Kwan and Sons hardware stenciled on the door in paint that had started to peel at the corners. She was somewhere in her 60s, built solid, with hands that looked like they'd spent a lifetime doing exactly the kind of work that required them to be strong. She shook Corinne's hand once, firm and brief, and didn't ask a single question about why a lawyer and a widow needed a locked filing cabinet opened without a key. Some cabinets you can pick in 30 seconds, she said, crouching in front of the gray metal drawer, running her fingers along the seam. This one's older. Might take me a minute. It took her 4. Threnody stood back with his arms crossed, and Corinne stood closer than either of them, close enough that when the lock finally gave with a small, unglamorous click, she was the first to see inside. There wasn't much. A single manila folder, thicker than she expected, the edges soft from handling. A smaller envelope tucked behind it, sealed, with her name written on the front in Julius's unmistakable handwriting, the loose, familiar version, not the tight one from the will his children had brought to Threnady's office. I want to look at this somewhere that isn't a storage unit, Corinne said, and her voice shook only a little. They ended up back at the diner. The 3 of them crowded into a booth meant for 2, coffee going cold again, while Threnody worked through the folder page by page with the careful, unhurried patience of a man who understood that speed here could cost more than time. Corinne held the sealed envelope in both hands and didn't open it. Not yet. She wanted to know what the folder held first. What it held, it turned out, was a full will dated 4 months before Julius died, notarized by a different attorney than the one who'd handled the shop sale. Someone named R. Pell, whose office, according to the letterhead, was 2 towns over in Camborne. Threnody read through it twice before he said anything. This isn't a draft, he finally said. This is a fully executed will. Witnessed, notarized, dated after the document your children presented to me. He looked up at Corinne. If this is legitimate, and I have no reason yet to think it isn't, it supersedes the one I read out loud in my office 2 weeks ago. Corinne's hands were shaking too hard to open the envelope herself, so Threnody did it for her, sliding a thin letter opener under the seal with the same careful patience he'd shown the folder. Inside was a single page, handwritten, dated the same day as the will. Corinne, if you're reading this, it means something happened to the will I meant to leave with you, and someone found a way around it. I should have told you what I was doing while I still could. I was afraid of what it would mean between us and the kids if I said it out loud. I'm sorry for that. You gave me 40 years I didn't do enough to deserve, and I wasn't going to let the last thing I did be handing everything to 2 people who only started calling once they smelled money coming. Ask Pell's office for the rest. He'll know what to do. Corinne read it 3 times before she trusted herself to speak. I need to go back to work, she said abruptly, folding the letter with hands that still hadn't stopped trembling. I can't just sit here waiting for this to sort itself out. I have $1,100 and a car that might not survive another month. It was Odessa who spoke first, still sitting across the booth with a coffee she'd barely touched. I've got an opening at the store. Cashier, some stocking, mornings mostly. Pays honest, not much, but it's steady. She said it plainly, without any performance of kindness in it, the way you'd offer someone a ride home in the rain. You don't have to say yes today. Corinne said yes before Odessa finished the sentence. The next weeks moved in a strange double rhythm. By morning, she was behind the register at Kwan and Sons, learning the layout of a hardware store she'd never once had reason to enter in 39 years of marriage to a man who fixed engines for a living, ringing up paint cans and box nails for men who had no idea the woman handing them their change had a second while sitting in a lawyer's safe 2 miles away. By afternoon, she sat in Trinity's office while he worked the phones, tracking down the notary who'd witnessed the signing, requesting records from Pell's office in Camborne, building what he called, with the flat calm of someone who'd done this before, a paper trail that can survive a courtroom. Dominic called twice during those weeks. Both times, Corinne let it go to voicemail. Vivian texted once, a single line asking if her mother had found somewhere to stay, which Corinne read 4 times trying to decide if it was concern or logistics dressed up as concern and never fully settled on an answer. Her neighbor, a retired carpenter named Silas Fenwick, who'd lived 2 doors down from the Larchmont house for 11 years and had said maybe 40 words to her total in that time, showed up on a Saturday with a toolbox and offered to fix the transmission problem himself before she wasted money on a shop. She didn't know why he'd offered. She didn't ask. She'd learned, in the space of 3 weeks, that some people simply showed up when it mattered and didn't need thanking for it out loud. She still hadn't cashed the $2 check. It sat in the drawer of her nightstand at the small rented room she'd taken above a laundromat on the edge of town, folded into quarters, a reminder of exactly what her children had thought she was worth and exactly how wrong they'd turn out to be. 2 weeks into the investigation, Malcolm Trinity called Corinne at the store during her lunch break, and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Certainty. The notary confirmed it, he said. In person on the record. A woman named Grace Halloway, retired now, but she kept her old logs. She witnessed Julius sign that will in Pell's office on the 14th of July, for months before he died. She remembers him specifically, she says, because he told her it was important that his wife never find out he'd been in, not until it mattered. Corinne sat down on an overturned bucket of drywall screws in the back aisle of Kwan and Sons and let that settle into her. Julius hadn't just quietly protected her. He'd planned it, deliberately, in secret, because some part of him had already suspected what his children might try to do. And the other will, she said, the one from the reading, that's where it gets more complicated and more damning. Trinity's voice had the careful weight of a man choosing every word. I had a forensic document examiner look at both signatures. She's done work for 3 different county courts, testified in contested estate cases before. Her opinion, in writing, is that the signature on the will your children presented shows signs consistent with tracing. Not a perfect match to any known method, but enough irregularity in the pen pressure and stroke consistency that she's willing to say, under oath if it comes to that, she doesn't believe your husband signed it himself. Someone traced his signature. Someone with access to a genuine signature to trace from. And access to a notary willing to either look the other way or be fooled into thinking the signing happened the way it was supposed to. He paused. I've requested the notary records for that document too. I expect we'll hear back within a week. They heard back in 4 days. The name on the notary log for the first will, the one that gave Dominic and Vivian everything, belonged to a man who had voluntarily surrendered his notary license 8 months earlier after an unrelated complaint, and who, according to the state registry, should not have been legally authorized to notarize anything on the date stamped on that document. Corinne read the report twice in Trinity's office, then set it down on his desk with hands that had finally, weeks later, stopped shaking every time she touched anything connected to Julius's death. What happens now, she asked. Now I file a petition to have the second will, the real one, admitted to probate, and to have the first one formally challenged as fraudulent. Your children will be notified. They'll have the opportunity to respond, likely through an attorney of their own. He folded his hands on the desk. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Aldergate. Cases like this can get ugly before they get resolved. I'd rather prepare you for that than let you walk in expecting it to be simple. It was never going to be simple, Corinne said. Not with those two. Dominic showed up at the hardware store 6 days later, not at Trinity's office, not at her rented room, but at the register where she was ringing up a customer's paint order as if catching her at work would somehow put her at a disadvantage. He waited until the customer left before he spoke. You're trying to destroy this family, he said. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the 11 days she'd spent standing on a concrete floor scanning barcodes for $9 an hour. Do you understand what a forgery accusation does to people? Vivian's husband works in finance. This kind of thing follows people. Your father's real wishes follow people too, Dominic. Apparently that mattered less. We don't know that's real. Some lawyer you barely know shows up with a folder, and suddenly Dad's a different person. Suddenly everything we thought we knew is wrong. I didn't ask Malcolm Trinity to find anything. He found it because he does his job carefully, which is more than I can say for whoever forged your father's signature. Corinne kept her voice level, the way she'd learned to keep it level through 39 years of arguments that mattered far less than this one. You should ask yourself who had a notary friend willing to break the law for a fee, Dominic. Because it wasn't me. His jaw worked for a moment, the way it used to when he was 12 years old and caught in a lie he hadn't fully thought through. Vivian's the one who found the lawyer. The estate one. Trinity wasn't even the first choice. There was someone else, some guy Vivian's husband knew from the club. He caught himself saying it, and something in his face shifted, like a man realizing he'd just handed a weapon to the person standing across from him. Corinne didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She rang up the next customer's order, and when she looked up again, Dominic was already walking out the door, his shoulders set in a way that told her he understood, even if he wouldn't admit it out loud yet, exactly how much trouble that single sentence had just caused him. That single sentence gave Trinity exactly what he needed. Within a week, he'd traced the guy from the club to a man named Preston Farrow, a notary and part-time estate consultant who'd had his license revoked 8 months earlier for backdating a document in an unrelated inheritance dispute in the next county over. Farrow, it turned out, still did business quietly, off the books, for people willing to pay enough not to ask questions about his revoked credentials. Vivian's husband, Trinity discovered through a trail of emails obtained during discovery, had used Farrow twice before for minor real estate paperwork and recommended him to Vivian without ever mentioning the revocation. I don't think Vivian knew. Not at first, Trinity told Corinne, laying the emails out across his desk in the order he'd pieced them together. But there's a message here from her to Farrow 6 weeks before your husband died, asking whether it was possible to update some paperwork without Julius needing to be present for the actual signing. Farrow's response says, and I'm reading this directly, not a problem, I've handled worse, just need something with his real signature on it to work from. Corinne stared at the printed email for a long time. She thought about the birthday card Julius had signed and mailed to Vivian the year before he died. The one Vivian had probably kept somewhere in a drawer, never imagining her mother would one day understand exactly why it mattered that she had. She used one of his cards, Corinne said quietly. Or a check. Something with his real signature on it. That's my working theory, yes. I can't prove which document specifically. Not yet. But the timeline fits. Farrow had something to trace from 6 weeks before Julius passed, and the fraudulent was dated 3 weeks before his death, when Julius was, according to his hospice records, largely unconscious for most of each day. It was the hospice records that finally broke something loose in Corinne's chest, some tight, disbelieving knot she'd been carrying since the reading. She remembered those final weeks with a clarity that made the fraud almost impossible to bear. Julius sleeping 18 hours a day. Julius unable to hold a pen steady enough to sign his own name on the release forms for a home health aide, so that Corinne had signed for him, with his permission, the nurse standing right there as a witness. There was no version of those 3 weeks in which her husband sat up, alert and capable, and rewrote his entire estate in his children's favor. Whoever had staged that signing had done it around a man who could not have meaningfully consented to anything. Threnody filed the petition the following Tuesday. The county probate court set a hearing date for 6 weeks out, standard for contested estates. He explained, though he expected Dominic and Vivian's attorney to push for delays once they understood the strength of the evidence stacked against them. He was right. 2 separate continuances were requested and granted over the following 2 months, each one stretching Corinne's patience thinner, each one a fresh reminder that money bought time even when it couldn't buy truth. She kept working at Kwan and Sons through all of it. Odessa never asked about the case, never pried, but she started leaving the good coffee out in the break room instead of the store brand, and once, without comment, handed Corinne an envelope with $300 in it after a particularly brutal week, saying only, "Consider it in advance, pay it back whenever, or don't." Silas Fenwick fixed the transmission on her car for the cost of parts alone, and when she tried to pay him labor on top of it, he waved her off with the same gruff, unbothered kindness he'd shown from the start. "Julius fixed my boat engine for free back in '96, he told her. "Never forgot it. Figure this evens something out." Corinne began, slowly, to understand something she hadn't let herself think clearly about since the funeral. The people showing up for her now, Odessa with her quiet generosity, Silas with his toolbox, Threnody with his careful, methodical determination to get her justice. He wasn't even being paid enough to chase this hard. None of them owed her anything. They weren't blood. They weren't obligated by 40 years of shared history the way her children were. And yet they'd shown up anyway, again and again, in ways Dominic and Vivian never had, not once in the 11 months since their father's diagnosis. She still hadn't cashed the $2 check. Some nights, in the rented room above the laundromat, she took it out of the nightstand drawer and looked at it. Not with the raw humiliation she'd felt walking out of Threnody's office that first day, but with something closer to clarity. It wasn't an insult anymore, not exactly. It was evidence. A small, torn piece of paper that would eventually help prove, in a courtroom, exactly how far 2 people were willing to go to erase what a dying man had actually wanted. The hearing took place on a gray Thursday in late February, in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old carpet and radiator heat. Corinne wore the navy dress she'd worn to Julius's funeral, the only formal thing she owned that still fit, and sat beside Threnody at a table that felt too small for the weight of what was about to happen at it. Across the aisle, Dominic and Vivian sat with their attorney, a sharp-suited man named Everett Cole, who kept glancing at his watch as though the proceeding were an inconvenience scheduled around something more important. Threnody built his case the way he'd built everything over the past 4 months, methodically, without flourish, letting the documents do the talking. He called Grace Halloway first, the retired notary, who testified in a clear, unhurried voice about witnessing Julius Aldergate sign his reel on the 14th of July, and about the specific words he'd used that day, that he didn't want his wife finding out until it mattered, because he was afraid of what the knowledge might do to the family while he was still alive to see it fracture. He called the forensic document examiner next, a woman named Priya Basra, who ran her own consulting practice out of Portland and had testified in 11 prior probate disputes. She walked the court through the pen pressure analysis, the stroke inconsistencies, the telltale hesitation marks that appear when a hand traces a signature rather than producing it naturally. She was precise and unemotional in a way that made the conclusion land harder than any dramatic accusation could have. The signature on the will presented by Dominic Aldergate and Vivian Aldergate Cross had not been produced by Julius Aldergate's own hand. Then Threnody called Preston Farrow. Farrow had been subpoenaed 3 weeks earlier, and it showed in the way he sat, hunched slightly, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes for more than a second at a time. Facing the possibility of criminal charges for practicing without a valid notary license and knowingly witnessing a fraudulent document, he'd struck a deal with the district attorney's office to testify truthfully in exchange for leniency. He confirmed, in a flat, defeated voice, that Vivian Aldergate Cross had approached him 6 weeks before her father's death, that he'd used a canceled check bearing Julius's genuine signature to produce the tracing, and that the signing itself had never happened, not with Julius present, not with Julius conscious. not with Julius aware in any way that his name was being written onto a document that would give away everything he'd built. Corinne watched her daughter's face while Pharaoh spoke. Vivian stared straight ahead at the judge's bench, her jaw tight, her hands folded so hard in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. Dominic looked, for the first time since the reading in December, genuinely afraid. When it was Corinne's turn to speak, Threnody asked only a handful of questions, enough to establish the marriage, the years of care during Julius's illness, the $2 check she still hadn't cashed. She answered plainly, without performance, because there was nothing left to perform. The facts spoke for themselves by then. Everett Cole, to his credit, didn't put up much of a fight. He'd clearly understood, well before the hearing, exactly how thin his client's position had become. His cross-examination was brief, procedural, the questions of a man going through the motions because his clients were paying him to, not because he believed the outcome could still be changed. The judge took less than an hour to rule. The will dated 4 months before Julius Aldergate's death. The one found locked in a filing cabinet was admitted to probate as his valid and final testament. The document presented at the December reading was ruled fraudulent, its execution void. Dominic and Vivian Aldergate Cross were ordered to return, in full, any assets they had already liquidated or spent from the estate, and the case was referred to the district attorney's office for further investigation into potential criminal fraud charges against both of them and against Preston Pharaoh. Corinne sat very still when the ruling was read. She had expected, somewhere in the back of her mind, to feel triumphant. What she felt instead was quieter than that, something closer to the release of a breath she'd been holding since a Tuesday afternoon in a leather chair, being handed $2 by a man who wouldn't look at her. Outside the courthouse, Dominic tried to approach her on the steps, his voice pitched low, urgent. "Mom, please, we can figure this out as a family. We don't have to let it go this far. The criminal stuff, we can talk to the DA together." "You should have thought about family 4 months before your father died," Corinne said, "when you were tracing his signature onto a document while he was too sick to lift his own head off a pillow." Vivian said nothing at all. She simply looked at her mother, once, and then turned and walked toward the parking lot. And Corinne understood, watching her go, that whatever conversation might eventually happen between them, it would not be today, and it might not be for a very long time. The house on Larchmont Avenue sat empty for another 3 weeks while the estate was formally settled, and Corinne found herself standing in the driveway on a Sunday afternoon in March, keys in hand, unable to make herself walk through the front door. 39 years of marriage had happened inside those walls. So had 8 months of watching her husband die by inches, and 4 months, she now understood, of secret trips to a lawyer's office in Camborne, made without her knowledge, to protect her from exactly the betrayal that had come anyway. It was Odessa who finally talked her through the door, standing beside her in the driveway with the same plain, unhurried patience she brought to everything. "Houses don't stay haunted forever," she said. "Just the first few times you walk in. Then it's just a house again." She was right, mostly. The first walk-through was hard. The kitchen still smelling faintly of the coffee Corinne used to make every morning, the mantel still bare where Julius's urn had sat during those terrible weeks before the funeral. But by the second visit and the third, it started to feel less like a museum of grief and more like something she was allowed to reclaim. She moved back in at the end of March, not because the money had suddenly changed her, though there was money now, the full estate finally released to her as its rightful heir, but because it was the last place Julius had chosen to live, and she found she wasn't ready to let it belong to anyone else's version of the story. She kept things simple at first. She didn't quit the job at Kwan and Sons, not right away, though Odessa told her more than once she didn't need to keep showing up at 6 in the morning to stock paint cans. Corinne kept coming anyway, 3 mornings a week, because she discovered somewhere in the last 4 months that she liked the version of herself who worked with her hands and talked to strangers about wood stain and didn't spend every waking hour thinking about lawyers and courtrooms. Silas Fenwick became a regular fixture at the house, first fixing a porch railing that had been loose for years, then a fence, then simply showing up on Saturday mornings with coffee and no particular project in mind, content to sit on the back steps and talk about nothing important. Corinne understood, slowly, That what she'd built with him and with Odessa over those 4 hard months wasn't friendship born of convenience. It was the kind of loyalty that shows up uninvited and stays without being asked, the kind her own children had never once offered her. Not during the diagnosis, not during the 8 months of hospice, not during a single one of the years leading up to it. Malcolm Thrinity stopped by in April with paperwork that needed her signature, the final closeout on the estate, and stayed longer than the visit required. He told her, almost sheepishly, that he didn't usually get this invested in a case, that something about the $2 check sitting on his desk during that first phone call had made the whole thing feel less like paperwork and more like something he owed her to see through properly. "You didn't owe me anything," Corinne told him. "You could have filed the will you were given and never looked in that filing cabinet at all." "I could have," he agreed. "I didn't want to live with having made that choice." The criminal case against Preston Farrow moved forward that spring, resulting in a plea deal and a suspended license permanently revoked, along with a fine he'd likely spend years paying off. The charges against Vivian and Dominic took longer, complicated by their attorneys' efforts to argue diminished culpability, that they hadn't personally forged anything, that Farrow had acted alone once hired. In the end, both accepted a deal that avoided prison but left them with felony fraud convictions on their records, mandatory restitution, and a judgment that would follow both of them, professionally and financially, for years. Corinne didn't feel satisfaction when she heard the final terms. She felt mostly tired and a little sad, in the particular way you feel sad about something you know is necessary and right and still costs more than anyone wanted to pay. Dominic reached out once more in early summer, a short email asking if they could talk. No lawyers, no cameras, just the two of them. Corinne read it several times before she answered. She didn't say no. She also didn't say yes right away. She told him she needed time, and that if a conversation happened, it would happen on her terms, at her pace, with no promises about where it might lead. Vivian never reached out at all, not that summer. Not by the time the first anniversary of Julius's death came, and when in November, marked quietly by Corinne alone at his grave, with flowers she'd grown herself in the garden behind the house on Larchmont Avenue. By the following spring, Corinne Aldergate had built something she hadn't expected to find at 68 years old, starting over from a $2 check in a rented room above a laundromat. She still worked mornings at Kwan and Sons, though Odessa had made her assistant manager by then. Mostly, she said, so Corinne would stop trying to insist she didn't deserve the raise that came with it. She still saw Silas most weekends, and their friendship had settled into something comfortable and unhurried, the kind that didn't need a name to matter. She'd started keeping a garden behind the house on Larchmont Avenue, the same spot where Julius used to store his boat trailer, turning over soil with her own hands until something grew there that hadn't existed before. Malcolm Thrinity checked in every few months, not for legal reasons anymore, just to see how she was doing, and somewhere along the way he'd stopped being the lawyer who'd found the folder and become simply a friend she trusted more than almost anyone. When his own mother passed away that winter, Corinne was one of the first people at the funeral, and she understood, standing beside him at the graveside, that the 4 months they'd spent building a case together had built something else at the same time, quieter and just as real. She thought often about the letter Julius had left her, tucked in that sealed envelope behind the folder in the filing cabinet. "You gave me 40 years I didn't do enough to deserve, and I wasn't going to let the last thing I did be handing everything to two people who only started calling once they smelled money coming." She understood now what it must have cost him, sick and frightened and running out of time, to make those secret trips to Camborne, to sit across from a notary he'd never met, and put into writing the thing he couldn't bring himself to say to his own children's faces. He'd protected her the only way he knew how, quietly, thoroughly, trusting that if the fraud ever surfaced, she'd have exactly what she needed to fight it. He'd been right. Dominic reached out again that spring, and this time Corinne agreed to meet him at a coffee shop in town, neutral ground, the same instinct that had made her choose a diner over Thrinity's office all those months before. He looked older than she remembered, thinner, worn down by a year of restitution payments and a felony record that had cost him his job at the firm where he'd worked for a decade. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for forgiveness, not directly. He said only that he was sorry, that he'd let greed and Vivian's certainty carry him somewhere he should have refused to go, and that he understood if it took years before his mother trusted a word he said again. It will, Corinne told him plainly, without cruelty. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I'm willing to let you show me who you are now, slowly, if you actually mean it. It was a small opening, not a reconciliation, not yet, maybe not ever fully. But it was something, and Corinne had learned by then that she no longer needed her children's presence to feel whole. She had built that herself, out of a $2 check and a locked filing cabinet, out of Odessa's quiet generosity and Silas's toolbox and Malcolm's stubborn refusal to leave his signature unquestioned. Vivian never reached out. Corinne stopped waiting for her to, somewhere around the second anniversary of Julius's death, and found that letting go of the waiting was its own kind of peace. She still has the check. It's framed now, on a shelf in the study where Julius used to keep his shop records, not as a wound anymore, but as a reminder of exactly how far someone can underestimate you and how completely they can be proven wrong. She takes it down sometimes, on hard days, and looks at it, and remembers the woman who sat in that leather chair, certain her husband had left her nothing, certain that 39 years had somehow added up to $2 and a closed door. That woman had been wrong. Not about the money, though that mattered less than she once thought it would, but about her own worth, about what she'd built, about what still belonged to her, even when the people who should have protected it tried to take it away. Julius had known, at the end, exactly who deserved to inherit what he'd spent a lifetime building. It had just taken a locked drawer, a careful lawyer, and a woman brave enough to ask what was really inside it, to prove he'd been right all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.